The easiest way to steal a man's future is to convince everyone his past never existed. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I stood at the back of a packed county auction hall listening to an auctioneer celebrate the sale of my family's 5,200-acre farm like it was just another piece of forgotten real estate. The room smelled of fresh coffee, polished wood, and expensive cologne, the kind worn by people who treated land as numbers on spreadsheets instead of memories carved into generations. Sunlight poured through the tall courthouse windows, reflecting off polished cowboy boots and pressed business suits, while conversations bounced across the room with confident laughter. Nobody noticed the quiet man standing against the back wall wearing a faded denim jacket and an old pair of work boots still carrying traces of dry Oklahoma soil. Nobody recognized me. That was exactly how I wanted it. A giant display board flashed sold beside my family's property description as applause rippled through the audience. The winning developer shook hands with a smiling woman dressed in an ivory blazer who carried herself like she owned the county. Victoria Ellsworth, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, accepted congratulations from everyone around her as if she had just completed some great civic achievement. I watched her accept compliments with that perfectly rehearsed smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She pointed toward a glossy rendering showing luxury homes, private lakes, tennis courts, and winding streets stretching across the same rolling fields where my grandfather had taught me how to repair fences before I was old enough to drive a truck. They called it progress. I called it theft wrapped in paperwork. The auctioneer announced that all ownership questions had already been resolved, every title verified, every signature confirmed. Hearing those words almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I folded my hands behind my back and listened carefully while Victoria thanked local officials, attorneys, investors, and community leaders for believing in her vision. She spoke about improving property values, strengthening neighborhoods, and removing abandoned farmland from productive use. Abandoned. That single word echoed louder than the applause. My family had worked that land for nearly a century. Every pasture, every fence line, every weathered barn carried a story that couldn't be measured in acres or dollars. Yet somehow, according to the documents everyone trusted, I had supposedly disappeared long enough for strangers to sell my entire inheritance. The air conditioner hummed softly above the crowd while a projector displayed architectural drawings over photographs of my farm, replacing wheat fields with swimming pools and replacing cattle trails with decorative sidewalks. Investors nodded with excitement. Lawyers exchanged business cards. Surveyors discussed deadlines. Everyone seemed eager to celebrate a future already built upon a lie. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and felt the familiar weight of a worn leather document holder. Inside rested papers far older than anything displayed on that projector. Papers nobody in this room believed still mattered. Papers that had survived floods, droughts, recessions, and 3 generations of Whitmore hands protecting them. I looked once more at Victoria as she proudly accepted another handshake. She had absolutely no idea that within 48 hours, she wouldn't be standing in another auction hall. She would be walking into a courtroom expecting one final victory, only to look toward the judge's bench and finally understand why I had never tried to stop today's sale. Most people looked at that farm and saw empty fields stretching beyond the horizon. I saw fingerprints. Every weathered fence post, every crooked windmill, every oak tree leaning against the Oklahoma sky carried the quiet signature of someone in my family. My great-grandfather bought the first 800 acres with money he earned hauling cattle before paved highways reached this part of the state. My grandfather spent 40 years expanding it one neighboring parcel at a time until the property reached 5,200 acres. He never chased wealth. He chased permanence. He believed land was the only thing that remembered honest people long after everyone else forgot their names. As a boy, I learned more sitting beside him in an old pickup than I ever learned inside a classroom. He taught me how to read clouds before storms arrived, how to judge healthy soil by its smell after a light rain, and how silence could tell you just as much as conversation if you were patient enough to listen. Even now, I can still remember the crisp scent of freshly cut hay drifting through an open truck window while the tires crunched across gravel roads that had never appeared on any tourist map. Every Saturday morning started the same way. Coffee brewed before sunrise. Work gloves hanging beside the back door. The distant rumble of tractors slowly waking up with the morning light. Those sounds became part of who I was long before I ever wore a suit for work. When my grandfather passed away, people assumed I would eventually sell everything. They thought no one my age wanted responsibility measured in thousands of acres instead of office buildings. What they never understood was that the farm had never been an investment. It was a promise. I modernized equipment, upgraded irrigation systems, hired local families, and quietly placed the property into a carefully structured family trust exactly as my grandfather instructed years before his health declined. Every deed, survey, easement, and mineral record was organized with almost obsessive precision because he believed paperwork protected honest work just as much as fences did. Outside the county, almost nobody knew my name. That suited me perfectly. I drove an aging Ford pickup with more scratches than chrome, bought boots because they lasted instead of because they looked fashionable, and stopped at the same family diner every Thursday morning where the waitress never asked what I did for a living. She simply poured coffee before I sat down. Privacy became a habit rather than a strategy. I never corrected people when they assumed I was just another rancher managing inherited land. It was easier that way. People reveal far more about themselves when they believe you have no authority over them. Looking back now, that quiet life explains why Victoria never bothered asking questions before building her entire plan. She searched property records. She studied tax filings. She investigated trust documents. She spoke with surveyors, brokers, and local officials. Yet she never once asked the simplest question of all. Who exactly was the man whose signature appeared on every legal document she thought she had outsmarted? Sometimes confidence creates a blind spot larger than ignorance ever could. And as I watched strangers celebrate what they believed was the end of my family's story, I realized they had spent months studying my land while completely overlooking the person standing right in front of them. Victoria Ellsworth did not become president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association by accident. She understood one simple truth better than almost anyone I had ever met. Most people never read the documents they signed, and the few who did rarely questioned someone who spoke with enough confidence. She had spent nearly a decade building a reputation as the woman who could solve any zoning dispute, smooth over any development proposal, and persuade county offices to move paperwork faster than anyone thought possible. She always arrived in tailored clothes, drove a spotless luxury sport utility vehicle, and carried a leather portfolio that made every conversation feel official before a single word was spoken. The faint scent of expensive perfume always followed her through public meetings, mixing with fresh printer ink and polished conference tables until authority itself seemed to have a fragrance. To her supporters, she was a visionary. To contractors, she was an opportunity. To investors, she was the person who could transform open farmland into profitable neighborhoods. She called my family's property underutilized. She described it as an obstacle standing in the way of progress. At one community meeting, I sat quietly in the back while she pointed at aerial photographs of my farm projected across a giant screen. She traced future roads with a silver pointer, marked locations for shopping centers, schools, walking trails, and hundreds of upscale homes. The audience applauded every colorful rendering without asking. The one question that mattered: who actually owned the land beneath those drawings? Victoria had already prepared an answer before anyone asked. According to the presentation, the ownership records had become legally consolidated after years of administrative corrections involving inactive trust filings and abandoned agricultural classifications. The explanation sounded complicated enough that nobody challenged it. Complicated language has a remarkable way of disguising very simple dishonesty. Behind the scenes, survey companies began placing temporary markers along fence lines that had stood undisturbed for decades. Real estate brochures appeared showing smiling families standing beside ponds that already existed on my property. Developers toured the fields wearing polished boots that had clearly never touched real mud. Even local newspapers praised the upcoming transformation without speaking to a single member of my family. Every announcement made the illusion stronger. Every handshake made the transaction appear more legitimate. Friends from neighboring ranches started calling me after seeing advertisements they assumed I had approved. They asked when I decided to retire. I simply thanked them for letting me know and wrote down every date, every publication, every statement, and every name. I never corrected the rumors. I never confronted Victoria. The quieter I remained, the bolder she became. Soon she stopped speaking about possibility and started speaking about certainty. She congratulated investors before contracts officially closed. She promised construction schedules before permits received final approval. She even joked during one luncheon that forgotten farms had a funny way of finding ambitious new owners. The room filled with laughter. I smiled politely from across the hall while stirring a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. Watching her celebrate so confidently almost made the entire scheme seem flawless. Almost. Because every confident speech, every promotional brochure, every recorded meeting, and every signed document quietly added another piece to a timeline she believed would prove her success, but would eventually tell a very different story. The public story was simple. A forgotten farm had finally found a better future. The real story unfolded in quiet places where almost nobody paid attention. It started with certified letters arriving in my mailbox every few days, each one printed on heavy paper that smelled faintly of fresh ink and legal confidence. The first claimed a boundary adjustment had been approved. The second announced that several internal access roads would soon be inspected. The third informed me that utility easements had been updated to support future community infrastructure. Individually, each notice sounded routine. Together, they formed a roadmap leading somewhere they hoped I would never notice until it was too late. Then came the survey crews. Bright orange flags appeared across pastures where cattle had grazed peacefully for decades. Wooden stakes marked imaginary streets cutting through hay fields that still belonged to my family. Pickup trucks carrying engineering firms rolled slowly along gravel roads every morning, leaving behind fresh tire tracks and the sharp smell of diesel hanging in the cool air long after they disappeared over the hills. I greeted every crew politely. Some apologized for disturbing the property. Others assumed I had already approved the work. I never corrected them. Instead, I asked simple questions, wrote down company names, photographed vehicle numbers, and quietly thanked each person before continuing my day. Victoria, meanwhile, became more confident with every passing week. She stopped referring to the development as a proposal and started calling it the future of Cedar Ridge. During one town meeting, she proudly unveiled a scale model showing tree-lined streets replacing my north pasture, a clubhouse overlooking my grandfather's fishing pond, and elegant stone entrances where our old cattle gate had stood for nearly 60 years. The audience admired the display while cameras flashed. Nobody realized that the weathered wooden gate she intended to remove had been photographed in nearly every Whitmore family reunion since the 1970s. Every picture was carefully dated. Every date quietly mattered. Construction. Companies soon began requesting preliminary access schedules. Environmental consultants published reports. Marketing teams distributed glossy brochures promising peaceful country living on land they described as fully secured. Even the local bank announced financing opportunities for future homeowners before the first foundation had ever been poured. It amazed me how quickly assumption transformed into accepted fact. Once enough people repeated the same story, very few bothered verifying whether it had ever been true. Friends kept asking why I was not fighting back. They expected emergency hearings, public statements, angry interviews, or at least a lawyer standing beside me at a press conference. Instead, I spent most mornings repairing fences, checking irrigation pumps, and organizing old file boxes inside my grandfather's office. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, while the familiar smell of aged leather, cedar shelves, and yellowed paper filled the room. Every receipt, every survey, every trust amendment, every county filing rested exactly where my grandfather had taught me to keep them. Order creates clarity. Clarity creates patience. And patience often unsettles people who expect panic. Victoria mistook my silence for surrender because she believed the loudest person controlled the story. She never imagined that every meeting she attended, every promise she made, every document she proudly displayed, and every deadline she announced was quietly building a record far more valuable than any argument I could have made in public. Without realizing it, she was assembling the evidence herself, one confident step at a time. By the time the auction ended, nearly everyone believed the story was finished except me. I drove back to the farm just before sunset, The familiar gravel road crunching beneath my old pickup while a warm breeze carried the scent of dry grass and freshly turned soil through the open window. The western sky glowed deep orange behind the weathered red barn, and for a few peaceful minutes the land looked exactly as it had when my grandfather stood beside me years earlier, reminding me that patience was usually the most valuable tool any landowner could possess. I parked beside the equipment shed, stepped onto the porch, and unlocked the small office where generations of Whitmore records had been preserved with almost unbelievable care. Inside, nothing had changed. The same oak desk rested beneath the front window. The same brass lamp illuminated shelves lined with leather binders. The grandfather clock in the corner continued marking each passing second with calm precision. While the rest of the county celebrated a development they believed was inevitable, I quietly began assembling a different timeline. Every certified letter went into chronological order. Every newspaper article received a handwritten date. Every public meeting recording was copied onto secure storage. Every promotional brochure was matched with the county filing that supposedly authorized it. I even compared weather reports against survey logs, because details often reveal patterns that confidence overlooks. As the evening grew darker, the office filled with the soft rustling of paper and the steady ticking of the clock, while a single desk lamp cast long shadows across documents that stretched nearly from one end of the desk to the other. Nothing about the process felt dramatic. It felt methodical. That was exactly the point. Truth rarely announces itself with excitement. More often it waits quietly inside ordinary records until someone finally arranges them in the proper order. Over the next several days, I continued living exactly as everyone expected. I inspected fences before sunrise. I checked water tanks. I spoke with neighboring ranchers about rainfall forecasts and cattle prices. At the local diner, I listened as customers praised the future neighborhood Victoria promised would transform the county. Some even congratulated me on what they assumed had been a profitable sale. I simply smiled, thanked them, and finished my breakfast without correcting a single misunderstanding. Every conversation taught me something. Every assumption revealed how completely Victoria controlled the public narrative. That control made her comfortable. Comfort made her predictable. Predictable people rarely notice when someone is. Carefully documenting every step they take. Late one afternoon, I received another envelope bearing official county markings. Inside was a formal notice confirming the date of the upcoming legal proceeding intended to finalize the remaining ownership questions. Victoria clearly expected the hearing to become nothing more than the last administrative step before construction crews arrived. I read the notice twice, placed it neatly on top of the growing stack of evidence, and closed the folder with deliberate care. Outside, the windmill turned slowly against the fading evening sky while the old barn door creaked in the breeze exactly as it had throughout my childhood. I rested one hand on the weathered wood and allowed myself the smallest smile. Victoria believed she had already won because she thought the most important room in this entire story had been the auction hall. She could not have been more mistaken. The room that truly mattered had always been waiting in silence, and very soon she would walk through its doors believing she was about to celebrate one final victory. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of quiet that only exists before something irreversible happens. A cool breeze drifted across the courthouse square carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and brewed coffee from a small cafe across the street, while the old clock tower echoed the hour through downtown. I parked my weathered pickup in the same public space I had used for years whenever work brought me into the city. Nobody looked twice. Lawyers hurried toward the entrance carrying leather briefcases. Reporters adjusted camera equipment outside the front steps, hoping for another routine property dispute involving a wealthy developer and an aging rancher. Victoria arrived exactly on schedule in a polished black sport utility vehicle that reflected the morning sun like polished glass. She stepped onto the sidewalk surrounded by attorneys, consultants, and investors, greeting each person with the relaxed confidence of someone already planning a victory luncheon. As she walked past me, she never slowed down. Her eyes met mine for only a second before moving on, dismissing me as nothing more than the stubborn farmer who had delayed an inevitable project. I nodded politely and continued toward a separate entrance without saying a word. Inside the courthouse, the familiar sounds never changed. Quiet conversations echoed through marble hallways. Court clerks rolled carts stacked with neatly organized case files. The faint smell of polished wood mixed with fresh paper and floor wax, creating an atmosphere built on routine, discipline, and order. I acknowledged several employees with a simple smile as they greeted me with professional courtesy. None of those brief exchanges caught Victoria's attention because she was focused on reviewing notes with her legal team while waiting outside the assigned courtroom. She glanced once at the closed courtroom doors, checked her watch, and confidently remarked that everything would be over before lunch. Her attorneys agreed. One of the developers laughed softly and mentioned that construction crews were already preparing equipment schedules for the following week. They believed the remaining hearing was merely another administrative formality. When the courtroom doors finally opened, everyone entered together. Spectators filled the gallery. Reporters settled into the back row with notebooks ready. Victoria walked toward counsel table wearing the same composed smile she had displayed at the auction, greeting familiar faces along the way. Then she looked toward the front of the courtroom. Her footsteps stopped. The conversation around her faded into complete silence. Every expression of confidence disappeared almost instantly as recognition replaced certainty. I was no longer wearing worn denim or dusty work boots. I sat behind the judge's bench in a black judicial robe beneath the seal of the court, reviewing the morning docket with calm attention before lifting my eyes toward the room. I did not smile. I did not speak immediately. The only sound was the steady turning of a single page as I finished reviewing the file placed before me. Victoria remained frozen where she stood, her attorneys exchanging confused glances as they struggled to understand what she had just discovered. Months of assumptions, unraveled in a matter of seconds because the quiet rancher she had ignored at every meeting had never been simply a rancher at all. She finally understood why I had never argued in public, never chased cameras, and never tried to interrupt the auction. Some truths become far more powerful when they reveal themselves at exactly the right moment. And as the courtroom settled into complete silence, the proceeding everyone expected was about to become something entirely different. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The courtroom, usually filled with the quiet rhythm of routine proceedings, felt almost suspended in time. I could hear the soft hum of the ventilation system, the distant ticking of the courtroom clock, and the faint rustle of legal pads as reporters slowly lowered their pens, unsure whether they had witnessed what they thought they had. Victoria remained standing beside her attorneys, her expression shifting from confidence to disbelief. She searched my face as though expecting some explanation that would restore the version of reality she had carried into the building only moments earlier. Instead, I simply reviewed the case file resting before me, allowing procedure to speak louder than surprise. When the courtroom settled completely, I addressed everyone with the same calm tone I used in every proceeding. I stated that after reviewing the parties involved and the information disclosed within the filings, I had determined that my long-standing ownership interest in the property created a direct conflict requiring my immediate recusal from any decision concerning the merits of the dispute. A quiet wave of confusion spread across the gallery. Victoria's legal team appeared relieved for only an instant, believing my withdrawal would remove the unexpected complication they had just encountered. They misunderstood the significance of what had already happened. My signature did not appear on the order resolving the property dispute. It appeared on a different order prepared under entirely different authority. I opened a separate folder, one that had remained closed until that very morning. Inside were certified records, chronological exhibits, public statements, recorded presentations, survey reports, promotional materials, and official filings collected over many months. Every document had been organized exactly as events unfolded. Every date matched. Every statement supported the next. The timeline did not rely upon assumptions. It relied upon records created by the very people who believed they had perfected their plan. I signed the administrative order directing that the property matter be reassigned to an independent judicial panel outside the district to eliminate any appearance of partiality. Immediately afterward, I signed a second order directing that the documented irregularities reflected within the submitted materials be formally referred to the appropriate investigative authorities for independent review under applicable law. Neither order declared anyone guilty. Neither order reached conclusions beyond the evidence already before the court. They simply ensured that every question raised by the documents would be examined through the proper legal process without influence from anyone connected to the underlying dispute. The clerk accepted both signed orders and quietly distributed certified copies. The sound of each page separating echoed through the silent courtroom with remarkable clarity. Victoria looked toward her attorneys, expecting immediate reassurance, but none came. Instead, they rapidly reviewed the documents placed before them, their earlier confidence replaced by careful concentration. One by one, they recognized familiar exhibits. The newspaper articles she had proudly quoted. The development presentations she had personally delivered. The survey schedules, recorded meeting minutes, promotional brochures, public announcements, and certified notices she had considered proof of inevitable success had become pieces of a much larger record. Nothing had been altered. Nothing had been exaggerated. Everything came from sources she herself had created or approved. As I rose from the bench to conclude my participation, I looked once across the courtroom. Victoria had spent months believing authority belonged to the loudest voice in every room. She was only beginning to understand that real authority often speaks quietly, follows procedure faithfully, and allows carefully preserved facts to carry far greater weight than confidence ever can. The weeks that followed unfolded far more quietly than most people expected. There were no dramatic speeches on courthouse steps, no triumphant celebrations, and no sudden declarations of victory. Instead, there were formal requests, carefully scheduled interviews, certified document reviews, and thousands of pages examined one file at a time. Independent investigators compared public statements with recorded filings, verified signatures against archived originals, and reconstructed the entire sequence of events exactly as they had occurred. The process was slow, deliberate, and remarkably thorough. Every survey marker placed across my pastures was matched to authorization records. Every promotional brochure was compared with the legal status of the property on the date it had been distributed. Every presentation delivered to investors was measured against county filings that existed at the same moment in time. Piece by piece, the picture became impossible to ignore. The confidence that had once surrounded the development gradually disappeared, replaced by careful questions from people who had previously accepted every explanation without hesitation. Investors requested additional documentation before releasing funds. Financial institutions paused pending transactions while ownership records were independently verified. Contractors postponed equipment deliveries. Marketing campaigns quietly disappeared from company websites. Even the large display signs announcing the future neighborhood were removed from the roadside one morning before sunrise, leaving behind only empty posts standing beside the highway. On the farm itself, the bright orange survey flags that had divided wheat fields into imaginary streets slowly vanished as inspection teams completed their work. The familiar landscape began looking like itself again. The old windmill continued turning above the north pasture. Cattle wandered peacefully through open fields that had briefly existed only as colored blocks on architectural drawings. The weathered barn doors still opened with the same familiar creak that had greeted 3 generations of my family. Nothing about the land had changed. Only the story people believed about it had changed. Victoria, meanwhile, no longer appeared at community meetings with polished presentations and carefully rehearsed promises. Her public appearances became increasingly rare as additional records continued surfacing from sources she had never expected anyone to examine so closely. The consultants who once praised the project began emphasizing that they had relied upon information provided to them. Investors focused on protecting their own interests. Business partners became noticeably quieter. The certainty that had once surrounded every announcement slowly dissolved under the weight of verified documentation. What surprised me most was not how quickly public opinion changed. It was how naturally it changed once people were given complete information instead of confident assumptions. Neighbors who had believed the farm was already gone drove past the property again, slowing beside the old entrance where my grandfather had built the original cedar gate decades earlier. The same gate Victoria had intended to replace with decorative stone columns remained standing exactly where it always had, weathered by countless seasons, yet still solid. One afternoon, I walked to the fishing pond she had featured as the centerpiece of a future private clubhouse. The water reflected the late afternoon sky, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of wild grass across the shoreline. I remembered the colorful scale model displayed at that community meeting and realized that every imagined street, every planned sidewalk, every elegant entrance had ultimately been defeated by something much less dramatic than anger. They had been defeated by patience, accurate records, and the simple decision to let facts speak in the order they had actually happened. Several months later, I walked the property before sunrise carrying nothing more than a cup of black coffee and the same worn work gloves my grandfather had left hanging beside the back door years ago. A thin layer of morning mist drifted across the pasture while the first rays of sunlight painted the fields in shades of gold. The air smelled of fresh earth, cedar, and dew resting on tall grass. Somewhere beyond the north fence, cattle moved slowly through the pasture, their familiar sounds blending with the steady creak of the old windmill that had become the quiet heartbeat of this place. Nothing about the farm looked extraordinary to a passing traveler. That was exactly what made it extraordinary to me. The survey stakes were gone. The promotional signs had disappeared. No glossy renderings stood beside the highway promising luxury homes that would never exist. The land had reclaimed its own story without ever raising its voice. I stopped beside the old cedar gate where countless family photographs had been taken over the decades. My grandfather used to rest one hand on that weathered post every evening before walking back toward the house, saying that a person should always leave something worth protecting for the next generation. At the time, I thought he was talking about land. Years later, I finally understood he was talking about integrity. Property can be inherited. Character cannot. It has to be earned one decision at a time. Looking across those 5,200 acres, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving ownership. It had been proving that patience could outlast arrogance and that carefully preserved truth could survive even the most convincing illusion. People often imagine justice arriving with dramatic speeches or emotional confrontations. My experience taught me something very different. Justice arrived through properly dated records, authentic signatures, complete timelines, and ordinary people willing to perform their responsibilities with honesty. The quiet county clerk who maintained archived filings. The survey technician whose notes remained accurate. The local newspaper that unknowingly preserved public statements. The family trust my grandfather insisted should be organized with meticulous care. Every small detail that once seemed insignificant eventually became part of a much larger picture. I walked toward the old barn and ran my hand across the weathered wooden door, feeling grooves carved by decades of changing seasons. That same door had appeared in family photographs, survived storms, and quietly waited while strangers imagined replacing it with something newer. It never needed replacing. It only needed someone willing to remember why it mattered. Before heading back to the house, I looked once more across the rolling fields stretching toward the horizon. The farm had taught me the same lesson it had been teaching my family for generations. Real strength does not demand attention. It endures. Real authority does not need to announce itself. It acts when the time is right. And real justice does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the facts that remain standing after every assumption has fallen away. I finished the last sip of coffee, opened the old cedar gate, and walked into another ordinary day on the land my family had protected for nearly a century, grateful that the most important inheritance I received was never measured in acres at all, but in the quiet certainty that truth, when guarded with patience and integrity, eventually finds its rightful place.